My name is Wright. I am the voice of reason. I speak for the Last Crusade. The Last Crusade begins this day. Our task is to retake possession of Western civilization. We have identified their 7 strongholds. Let us discuss strategy. Let us start with a discussion of the press. The battle is an unequal one. The forces of corruption need only to rot, to degenerate, and to destroy. Sea wave after sea wave can undermine even the tallest cliff. The enemy forces are greatly aided by the sins that beset any group of men, no matter how good-willed and upright. Envy, for example, will always bestow the ideas of socialism an extra magnetism and allure those ideas do not by right possess. Likewise, lust grants undue glamour to the tawdry deceptions of sexual liberation. The various sins need not dominate the majority for the corruption to take hold. They need only be present. These sins need only befog the sight of the watchman, relax the nerve of discipline, and make his sword blows soft and slow. An atmosphere of moral uncertainty, where every opinion is right, no one is wrong, and good and evil are matters of personal taste, is all that is needed in order for the progress of the disintegration of society to advance one more infinitesimal increment. Nor is there any easy answer, any safe way to wage this war, nor any earthly hope of victory. For every hand is against us. Every word scorns and opposes us, including the whisper of our own sinful hearts. Our hope is in heaven, or does not exist at all. The enemy is animated by one spirit. We need a spirit of equal strength on our side. The uniformity across generations of the enemy corruption is difficult to explain to anyone who thinks of ideas as being the creations of humans, rather than, as the truth of the matter shows, humans are the creation of ideas. Ideas possess us, as a ghost in a fairy tale can take possession of a living man, or, to use a more mundane example, as wine might obscure the wits, or beauty infatuate the senses. Ideas have a logic of their own. An obvious historical example of this is the inability of the United States, after rebelling against the British Crown on the grounds that all men are created equal, to maintain the institution of slavery unquestioned and unchallenged. The logic of the idea that all men are created equal creates an incentive, a psychological pressure, a force like a living spirit, which will carry anyone possessed by that idea to the conclusion that slavery must be abolished, whether he will or no, except and unless a contrary idea, a contrary spirit, rise up to oppose it. In this case, the opposing idea was the idea that the various tribes of Africa were one race, and the various nations of Europe whose sons were now living in America were another race, such that fate or heaven or nature had cursed the first with such inferiority to the second that slavery was justified, and hence the self-evident truth that all men are created equal was no longer self-evident. But an opposing idea, in turn, also creates incentives, psychological pressures, or a living spirit that also will come to possess the soul of anyone who opposes the first idea. When a man invites 2 opposing ideas to possess his soul, disaster results. The 2 spirits pull him in 2 opposite directions. He becomes a servant with 2 masters. Where and when their commands do not directly contradict each other, perhaps for a time, he can tolerate to serve them both. He hides himself in ambiguity as long as possible. But when matters come to a point, he must choose a priority. Logic cannot be the priority. A sense of pride, a touchiness concerning one's honor and reputation must become the priority. The pride of a Southern gentleman was a natural consequence, and made even discussions and debates about tariff policy or the admission of new territories to statehood a toxic mixture of self-interest, arrogance, and rage. The lesser or derivative ideas are controlled by a master idea or sovereign idea. Once a man or a society accepts the axioms of a sovereign idea, it is only by extraordinary effort that the ideas derived from it do not also come and take rightful possession of his mind or theirs. That is why, on matters as far removed from each other as climate science or race relations or pronoun grammar, to the fossil fuel industrial policy, to philosophical questions about the objectivity of reality, the enemy goose steps in eerily perfect unison. All these various conclusions fall out of the one living spirit that possesses them, one sovereign idea. Once the worldview of the cult of the enemy is accepted into one's mind, all these other conclusions and opinions on matters of judgment naturally follow. The enemy are all ruled by the same fell spirit. Politics springs from culture, but culture springs from a cult. That is, it springs from the sovereign ideas held to be transcendent, foundational, and sacred in a society. That is why the war is primarily spiritual, and the intellectual, cultural, and political battles are secondary. Nothing can be accomplished without prayer and fasting, but let us explore what more can be done in addition to that. Of necessity, this discussion will be a high-level, general overview suggesting strategies. The tactics by which those strategies will be put into place and carried out will change as the facts on the ground change from year to year and generation to generation, as the enemy changes his posture in response. Again, our war is a spiritual rather than a cultural or political war. A victory on the spiritual level opens the way to victories in culture and politics. A spiritual victory is necessary but not sufficient. It is missionary work. I do not propose to analyze which crusades of this war must be launched or in which order. The enemy carried out their operations over generations and assaulted the West in whatever institution proved the weakest at the time, nor did they ever surrender in the face of setbacks or obstacles. In the same way that for Christians no soul is too humble for salvation, for the enemy no group of any kind, from bankers to bird watchers, was beyond the reach of damnation. All were to be infiltrated. The missionaries of the devil were tireless. The absence of any coordinated resistance was and is a mystery to me, a shock and a wonder, and a blot of shame on the escutcheon of conservatives, Christians, and all decent men who slept. Let us remember the situation as it currently stands on the battlefield. The enemy has 7 proud towers, or unconquerable strengths or strongholds, into which they crept by slow stealth, masking their goal until the point where they felt confident enough to throw disguise aside and throw shut the gates outside of which the unwary and befuddled conservative finds himself. Previously, we identified the 7 strongholds the enemy holds captive in the modern generation, and we identified the deadly sins to whom no man is immune, whose powers of temptation give the enemy, as it were, an ally inside of all of us, making resistance difficult. The strongholds and their besetting sins were listed as the press, which is the stronghold of wrath, the cinema of lust, the city hall of envy, the marketplace and the corporate culture is the stronghold of greed, the academy is the stronghold of gluttony because it sold its soul for federal money, the salon of the intellectuals is the stronghold of pride, and finally the stronghold of sloth, unfortunately, is the church. Please note that these strongholds fall under 3 different expressions of power, namely subversive power, coercive power, and persuasive power. The press and the cinema are the subversive strongholds, for they are the means to indoctrinate the multitudes without openly admitting one's goals. City Hall holds the coercive power, which is the be-all and end-all of the game. It is intermingled and incestuously mixed with the marketplace. Persuasive power uses open debate or less obvious incentives to promote ideas, and this includes the economy and the salon, and to a lesser degree the church. Note that the church is also the seat of spiritual power, which is above subversive, coercive, or persuasive, and it informs them all and trumps them all. The weakening of the spirit in the West in general, and of America in particular, an embarrassment or uncertainty shed on the public witness of Christ, or the public display of the 10 Commandments in law courts, or on prayer in schools, as well as the defamatory portrayal of priests and preachers in films and shows, all of this was needed in order for the persuasive and the subversive and the coercive forces to corrupt the West. Let me make a note on definitions. Here, the various deceptive nonsense words the enemy uses to disguise his nature, means, and goals will not be emphasized. It is wearisome and deceptive to use words like liberal or progressive or leftist to refer to totalitarian tribal primitivists, mired in economic theories exploded since the Victorian era, whose movement is fundamentally religious rather than political. The enemy here means those who are secular in theology, totalitarian in politics, socialist in economics. In matters of art and literature, they glorify the aberrant, the vulgar, and the ugly. The enemy views man as a beast, his life as profane, not sacred. In matters of philosophy, they are taught that truth is subjective, reason is deceptive, and morality, they are taught, is brainwashing. They have an engine called the press, whereby the people are deceived. To recover the press, it needs to be outflanked, discredited, and starved of revenue. It is the most morally corrupt organization in the USA. It is also the most visibly and obviously corrupt. The general public, by now, by and large, is aware of the corruption. Whenever an organization becomes corrupted by the enemy, it ceases to have the ability to carry out its original function and can only work to promote and spread the mental virus of corruption. The completeness of the corruption can be measured in terms of how far from its original mission or purpose the organization has wandered in the pursuit of serving the enemy. In this case, the news has become a perfect and diametric opposite of what it was meant to be. Newsmen are meant to offer facts of public import to the public and venture opinions on the opinion pages to help interpret those facts. After corruption, the press operates as nothing more than the psychological warfare arm of the enemy, as activists for enemy political causes and as propagandists. The media primarily is a means to conceal the truth, create smokescreens, destroy lives, and undermine any attempts to publicize the truth. Matters of utmost public import are smothered and tossed into the memory hole. Trivial matters of either local significance or none at all gain nationwide public attention. Let me digress to speak at length about one example of bringing an absurdly trivial local matter to national attention, because it is necessary to preface remarks on counter-strategy with a remark about the psychology of the enemy assault. The example is this. We have all seen the clip of young Mr. Sandman, a remarkably polite Catholic lad from Tubbington Catholic High School, wearing a ball cap, being rudely confronted by a withered and ancient freak banging a drum in his face while chanting some pagan mumbo-jumbo. Even supposing the story had been what the news took it to be, namely, a sign of disrespect from a youth to a toothless old coot, how is this newsworthy? Even had the youth whipped out a switchblade and murdered the creepy old man to answer his addlepated yodeling and banging, it still would be solely a local story, unworthy of introduction into the national debate. It has value only according to magical thinking. In magical thinking, a sign or omen or symbol of an object, such as a wax doll or the image in a mirror, is confused with the real object, so that what harms one is thought to harm the other. That is why a voodoo doctor thinks he can curse a man by sticking pins into a doll symbolizing the man. Or why an Aztec ceremony of beating slave girls until they wept was thought to bless the coming rainfall because their tears symbolized the rain. In this particular case, the youth, because he wore a magical evil juju hat, was thought to symbolize Trump and all Trump supporters. And the act of having a drum beaten in his face was thought to symbolize the noise and commotion of the beating the racist Trump supporters, the magical symbolism of the old mystical world of play pretend, clearly and openly delivered against the toothless old coot. And so the press duly reported it. The story was not old coot bangs a drum in the face of a polite Catholic lad. The story was white lads in white-faced Trump supporters, hence racists, seen beating or threatening to beat a charming but venerable innocent old man of minority color. The toothless old coot then became a martyr due to the unreal but completely symbolic act of micro-oppression, and the sacrifice of martyrdom gave him mana, or spiritual power, with which he then could work witch doctor hocus pocus against Trump, who would then be cursed and carried away by winged monkeys, or something like that. The youth allegedly being rude to the crooked old yodel freak was newsworthy because the entire nation, like an audience of children clapping their hands so that Tinkerbell would spring to life once more, had to join in the faith act of cursing Trump to summon the winged monkeys. The problem with magical thinking is that first, there are no such things as winged monkeys, and second, even if there were, it is not the job of the news to work the mighty magics that summon them. Their job is to report the news, not to summon enchanted airborne simians to effect political change. But no man can serve two masters. One cannot be a witch doctor and a newspaper man at the same time. Any organization willing and able to spend time and effort to cast spells on Trump by finding innocent youths to act the unwilling part of living versions of a voodoo doctor's wax doll, that is, namely, a living person to act as the symbol or straw man to be used in a bogus strawman argument, cannot also tell the truth about anything, not even to identify what is or is not newsworthy. In the witch doctor's world, things have no innate value because there is no innate reality. They have no fixed nature. They have only symbolic value as the tools of witchcraft, tools used to shape and create reality. To the witch doctor, reality is fluid, and reality changes as the symbols change. This is the source of political correctness, namely the belief that words have a mystic power. Some take this literally, some not. The ones who take it literally are witches. For them, using a euphemism or elliptical phrase to disguise the nature of a bad thing, or using a smear word to obscure the nature of a good thing, changes its nature. Those who do not take this literally are cynics. Cynics believe words change psychology, not change reality. Political correctness severs men from the truth, hence severs them from their ability to resist. Pressuring men to call everything by names antithetical to their true names has a demoralizing effect on their spirit, halts rational discourse, and soaks the man who bows the knees to this pressure with humiliation and shame. To bully the weak is a joy, but to bully the weak into publicly proclaiming that the bully never bullied him is a joy beyond all joy. Political correctness is sadism disguised as altruism. For the same reason, any literary, scholarly, or scientific organization that embraces political correctness can no longer function in its primary function. Words no longer have meaning in the world of witchcraft, which means any organization whose work is the product of words, any intellectual or literary or scientific effort, can no longer do its work. Political correctness is the belief that factual correctness, that is, truth, is insignificant or does not exist at all. The truth, the world, the universe, is only what the consensus of conformity, the hive mind, the party, says it is. That is why the enemy will react with insane fury to polite questions or questions for proof or reasoning to support their narrative. Their narrative is a spell, a spider web of words spun out of nothing and based on nothing. It is being trapped on the holodeck. It is the Matrix. For a sane man, asking him a question or challenging his proof merely asks him to re-examine his opinions and conclusions, or to make explicit his axioms. Even if he finds new evidence or changes his mind, no damage is done to him. But to question the lies of a witch doctor threatens to destroy his spell, threatens to destroy his world. Without his hate, his life means nothing, so he must maintain his narrative to justify that hate at all costs. Likewise, to question the lies of the cynic shatters his whole approach and his only hope of victory. He cannot win using the truth. He shoots blanks because he has no ammo. It is either that or give up the fight, which means surrender power. But if his sad life had any other meaning or higher purpose than a grubby and sick search for power, he would not be a cynic, would he? The news is the publicity department for the enemy, but it's also more than that. It is an organ of information warfare cooperating with elements in the CIA and the FBI to undermine a duly elected president, which in effect undermines the very concept of democratic constitutional government. This is illegal and must be corrected with a vigorous prosecution of the law. So one strategic goal of the Last Crusade should be to challenge the political power of the press. In pursuit of this goal, the first strategy is to gain sufficient political power to drain the swamp of corruption which allows the newsmen to break the laws. The New York Times and others who cooperate with the Russian government and attempt a coup against the duly elected president of the United States must be fined. The officers and owners responsible must be jailed, if not hanged as traitors. This strategy should include not merely enforcing existing laws, but changing the laws. Whenever an organization operates with impunity or has an unchallengeable monopoly, look first to see what regulations or laws favor that organization or protect its position from challenge. For example, the news media has become controlled by a handful of corporations thanks to the Telecommunications Act of 1996. And likewise, 47 U.S.C. 230, a provision of the Communications Decency Act, holds the partisan information warfare agents like Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and search engines like Google to be immune from lawsuits, which otherwise would correct their high-tech censorship of conservative content. Once laws no longer favor the entrenched establishment loyal to the enemy, sovereign power will return to the consumer, and voting by the pocketbook will again be feasible. New platforms could then be developed and promoted, and boycotts will be a feasible means to punish partisanship in the media. Court rulings have granted the press an absurd immunity to libel laws given no other group in our society. This must be curtailed. It should not have been a protracted legal struggle for the Covington Catholic lad to avenge his good name against the defamation by the national press. Having the courts have the power to punish those who abuse their power by publishing defamatory and hurtful material in reckless disregard for the truth should not be nigh impossible. For what benefit was the press given the ability to destroy the good name of private citizens forever? Even public figures have nearly no recourse against libels spread by the press, particularly as they conspire to promote each other's stories. The news sources cooperate. I here speak from personal experience. When I was being defamed in the international media, the original newsman, having made false and actionable statements, immediately retracted them. But a dozen others then felt free to repeat as news the fact that the first had made this claim. But they did not bother to repeat the retraction. Not a single paper, not one, called me for a comment or even looked up my public record on the internet. The First Amendment is in no danger from a law that punishes defamation. It will change the incentives under which the press currently operates. In pursuit of the goal of challenging the political power of the press, the second strategy must be to change these incentives. We have heard that media giants go broke when they get woke, but the sad reality is that this is not so. Losing 1 million customers means nothing if the richest man in the world, or the largest nation state, floods money into the dying business. If Jeff Bezos or Red China is bankrolling you, it does not matter how many American consumer dollars you lose. Antitrust laws or proper foreign policy is needed to shut off this abuse of financial hegemony. The third strategy is to challenge the persuasive power of the news. This must take place on a psychological level and is to be propagated through the academy, through the arts, and through popular entertainment. This is the strategy of replacing witchcraft with logic and reason. The prestige and role of objectivity, logic, reason, and masculine thinking has been slowly, step by step, eroded by Marxism in the Victorian age, then by feminism and hippie sentimentality during the 1960s, and finally by left-wing racism and radicalism in the modern day. The enemy in the modern day uses racism to dismiss reasoning. Racism here refers to the pronouncements denigrating logic, reason, and masculine thinking, such as the one recently publicized by the National Museum of African American History and Culture, which dismissed self-reliance, the nuclear family with its traditional roles of man and wife, and objective linear rational thinking, all as Caucasian in nature and therefore despicable. In sum, the three centers of power are political, persuasive, and subversive. Politics uses force, persuasion uses rhetoric, subversion uses corruption. Our three strategies of response must be to use the rule of law to overcome force, to use reason to overcome rhetoric, and to use reformation to overcome subversion. No one man can devote his life to each of these three crusades. Prayer will bring to each man his sign or inspiration telling him where his talents might best be used. Missionary work can win cultures over, but the task is not small, not easy, and not without sacrifice. In the current day, the news is perhaps the weakest of the strongholds of the enemy because it is the most obviously corrupt, and it is slowly but surely losing readership, credibility, prestige, and power. Two simple words like cannon shots framed the opening salvo of this battle: fake news. Keep in mind that the news would not and could not be fake, and so obviously and so openly fake, were it not that a semi-illiterate and wholly uninformed body of dupes and gulls had not been prepared to demand and welcome such fakery. These fakes are meant to protect and augment the power and prestige of the Democrat Party, which is the political arm of the enemy, and were meant to glamorize the enemy actions in popular entertainment, law, academics, and all other areas where their banners are planted. But the fake news also flatters this same uninformed majority. It soothes, it lulls. Wrath particularly is flattered and stoked, but also pride and lust. Every victory for the sodomite lobby, for example, when publicly lauded with many an ovation, anesthetizes and silences the conscience of anyone whose sexual deviance is less, such as a mere adulterer or addict of pornography. As a matter of logic, if sodomy is illicit, then the sexual impulse is held to be paramount over all moral consideration of nature, biology, and logic. By definition, the sexual impulse so paramount must also excuse the violations of the oaths of adulterers, which only offend man, not nature, or the self-abuse of the sexual organs of onanists, or the abuse of the eyes with pornography. Such indulgences are unlawful, but not unnatural. The news cannot be correct unless the general society and all its corruptions is also corrected, at least in part. The fake news can only prevail if the multitudes are addicted to flattery and enamored of sentiment over logic and reason. Moral leadership is needed from the church. Instruction in simple, rational thought is needed from the schools. The endless flood of filth and emotional garbage from the popular entertainment needs to be cut off, or better yet, replaced with something clean, wholesome, and hale. The problem, that each problem is in one section of civilization, is encouraged and aided by the problems in other sectors, means that the battlefront is wide and deep. Let not your hearts be troubled, however. We are not in a catch-22 where the news cannot be reformed until the schools are reformed, and the schools cannot be reformed until the news is. Instead, we are in a situation where a crusade in any one sector against any of the strongholds of the enemy weakens the enemy elsewhere. Each man can use his talents to fight in the field where he is strong, on the battlefield of his choice. We are in a target-rich environment. Shall we reform the news industry? We must begin with ourselves in prayer and fasting.